Keith Hamburger, Managing Director, Knowledge Consulting. Thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I'm proposing some recommendations for change to the structure and content of your draft report in some areas. I do this with respect, as I believe that it's a very valuable report, and I'm well aware of the enormity of the task in conducting an inquiry of this nature. However, I fear the draft report as currently presented will not excite the attention of the wider community and decision makers for urgent and practical action to address the very tragic social and economic problem we face in Queensland, of which imprisonment is and recidivism is a symptom, not a cause. I believe that your report has the potential to be the most important catalyst for macro-structural change in the functioning of the criminal justice system and human service delivery agencies that I've seen in my more than 40 years of working in roles in criminal justice and family welfare systems. Potentially it could place Queensland at the forefront of social and economic change in lower socio-economic communities and in particular in First Nation communities, and I feel this opportunity must not be lost. I believe the report needs to depict the tragedy, emotion and the awful social and economic cost inherent in the issue of crime and recidivism, as well as the passion and the ideas for change that practitioners across human service delivery and criminal justice systems have. If these elements are not presented for the readers of the final report, I believe the report's impact will be diminished. In responding to your draft report, I recommended the starting point for your final report should be to address who are the people who commit crimes, go to prison, become recidivists, their demographics, and where do they go on release from prison. This data is readily available and much of it's referenced in the draft report. However, the report does not extrapolate this data to clearly identify what I see as the elephant in the room, and that is the significant causal factors of most crime, imprisonment and recidivism are dysfunctional families and communities beset by poverty, unemployment, neglected and abused children, violence, substance abuse, and with the majority of community members lacking the self-efficacy and agency to do something about this real state of affairs. If we were to identify the postcodes of all prisoners in Queensland, juveniles and adults, we will find the significant majority come from lower socio-economic communities, including First Nations peoples communities, where they are exposed to trauma caused by the circumstances I've just described. Therefore, it is no surprise that people in these circumstances commit crimes, often against their own family members, often against members of their own dysfunctional community or the wider community, and they ultimately go to prison. In terms of recidivism, following their incarceration, many return to their dysfunctional family and community circumstances, and of course it's no surprise that they become recidivists and re-offend. I think that clear identification of the above elephant in the room would allow your report to draw attention to some key issues. For example, these communities should not be demonised. They've been locked in a cycle of depression, hopelessness and dysfunctional behaviour over many decades. For a range of reasons, the challenges they face have not been addressed. Through your report, all of us must be confronted with the awful fact that these causal factors have created a human tragedy of immense proportions. It is destroying the life chances of thousands of children and hardwiring an increased juvenile and adult crime and recidivism rate, inflicting enormous pain and cost on victims, on the community for the next decade and beyond, unless we change our approach. I believe your report must create a sense of extreme urgency in the minds of people in the general community, in senior public servants and in the minds of our lawmakers, that we must approach this challenge in a new way. More of the same won't cut it, and your report can be the catalyst to achieve this. If this was a natural disaster, we would act with extreme urgency. For example, a cyclone, a flood, or a bushfire, and everything possible would be done to rectify the situation as quickly as possible. What we have here is a human, social and economic disaster of immense proportions that needs to be treated with the same sense of extreme urgency. Right now, in many identifiable communities, we have large numbers of homeless people. We have 10+ people living in houses with one toilet, no wage earner in the family, families going without food, women and children being shockingly abused, children roaming the streets at night. Tragically, many of them are safer there than at home. Places where substance abuse is rife. Many hundreds, perhaps thousands of children across Queensland not going to school. This is where crime and recidivism is bred. School truancy is endemic in a number of Queensland communities. In a First Nations community recently, elders told me that around 100 primary school children do not go to school at all. I saw evidence of this with groups of young people wandering the streets during school hours. Clearly, there are significant system failings. Preschool and primary school teachers in Queensland have said to me that they can identify children in their classrooms who are in grave risk of going to juvenile detention and prisons in their future life. I believe your report needs to reflect the emotion, the pain and suffering of these Queenslanders, in particular of the many women who desperately want change to their violent and neglectful circumstances, of the neglected children and also of the people who work at the bleeding edge of this terrible social and economic problem, such as teachers, social workers, police, correctional officers, magistrates, physical and mental health professionals and the not-for-profit agencies who did a lot of good in these circumstances. I feel deeply ashamed and frustrated when I visit these communities that as a society we look away from them. We have not acted with extreme urgency to address this intolerable situation. To capture the attention of the wider community and the decision makers, I believe your report needs to identify why we are in this mess and present practical solutions to the challenge that can be enacted urgently. Your report must demonstrate the massive social and economic benefits of these solutions. Do this and I believe you will capture the imagination and support for action to address this terrible situation. I fear that if we miss the opportunity created by this inquiry, then such an opportunity may not present for many years and the human tragedy will continue. Clearly, we need a paradigm shift in the way we address the challenges posed by dysfunctional families and communities, social breakdown, crime and recidivism. If we look internationally for inspiration, we find two completely different models, the USA and Northern Europe. It's fair to say that to date in Australia, we've largely followed the USA experience under the false notion that we can somehow punish crime away, a notion that is completely blind to the causal factors I've just mentioned of poverty-stricken dysfunctional families and communities. Offenders from these communities are not deterred from being criminals by the thought of going to prison. Sadly, prison for many has been a part of their family's existence for generations. Often it's a welcome respite where for a period they are well fed and have medical issues attended to. For many women, they are safer in prison than in their communities. When I last visited the USA to study corrections, I was appalled that in some states the corrections budget exceeded the education budget. Sadly, we are heading down this awful train wreck path. I spoke to a teacher in a juvenile detention facility in one of the southern states, and I asked him whether he enjoyed teaching in this environment. He replied, "I really do, sir. In these classrooms, I know they've been searched before coming in. They don't have knives or other weapons like when I taught in schools outside." I'm sure none of us wants to see our society go down this path, but sadly, that is where we are headed. Alternatively, in Northern Europe, where the lowest imprisonment rates in the world exist, human service delivery and criminal justice system agencies work together to address family and community dysfunction, crime and recidivism, under an overarching goal to preserve peace in society. So we get a peace goal, not a punishment goal. We can learn a lot from the Northern European approach. Our current policies ignore evidence that the most effective way to lift impoverished families and communities out of dysfunction is to build and support their capacity to help themselves, build their self-efficacy to create empowered families and communities. The evidence is that we have to stop doing things to and for people in these circumstances and instead support them to build the capacity to own and deal with their challenges and, importantly, reward them for doing so. This is a decent and cost-effective approach. In my submission to you, I suggested that if your final report commences from the position of identifying the elephant in the room that I've spoken about, of causal factors of crime and recidivism, then logically the report needs to address two specific questions. Question 1. What is the most effective place-based approach to strengthening or building self-efficacy in families and communities so they develop commitment and capacity to address their dysfunctional circumstances, such that social breakdown and crime is significantly reduced? And if we've addressed question 1, then question 2 is, what changes do we need to make in the structure and functioning of human service delivery agencies and the criminal justice system to support such a place-based approach? In my submission to you on your draft report, I have provided a model for a place-based approach to strengthen families and communities to reduce crime and recidivism, and for structural changes at the macro level to support such an effective place-based approach. The model I propose incorporates your draft report recommendation 18 for a Justice Reform Office, which I strongly support. I suggested that this office is tasked as lead agency for implementation of the holistic place-based approach that I proposed, and to achieve structural reform at the government agency level to eliminate the siloed service delivery we now have. My proposed model has support from senior public servants, First Nation leaders in Queensland and other states, First Nation community representatives across Queensland, members of the judiciary, senior academics and professional bodies involved with the criminal justice system. I have provided you with 11 recommendations that in my view are practical and achievable, and when implemented would result in the overarching goal for the criminal justice system to contribute to keeping peace in our society, to facilitate the justice system working in a holistic way with human service delivery agencies, a coordinated and holistic response across agencies to social dysfunction and crime, and structural reform to replace the siloed service delivery with a holistic place-based response that is owned and driven by local communities. Your proposed Justice Reform Office should be tasked to be the lead agency for structural reform that I proposed. There should be a change in sentencing policy such that secure prisons are used only for offenders who are sentenced to more than 12 months or for being dangerous offenders. This will achieve massive financial savings in forward estimates for secure prisons. It also allows for phasing out of large prison precincts, which is a totally failed concept. This will also provide comfort to the community that serious and dangerous offenders are being securely held and appropriately punished. That needs to be complemented by the creation of 24/7 supervised community custody options for offenders who otherwise would have received sentences up to 12 months because they no longer go to prison, with these facilities either being on traditional lands or in other agreed and appropriate locations. Currently, these offenders do not receive rehabilitation programs in Queensland prisons. That's the ones under 12 months. If they go into a community custody model, their rehabilitation will commence from day one. Community custody facilities with a therapeutic community approach would be owned and operated by First Nations and other charitable not-for-profit enterprises under the auspice of Child and Family Centre community hubs in partnership with the Queensland Government. These hubs would also deliver services such as special assistance education schools, community mentoring of offenders, housing services, aged care services, and engage in rural tourism industries and employment services. Thus, people in lower socioeconomic communities would be assisted to develop their capacities to provide many of these services and receive rewarding jobs. Surpluses from the operation of these initiatives would be invested back into their communities, and all of this strengthens families and communities. This holistic treatment approach will have a significant positive impact on reducing crime and recidivism, as well as significant operational savings across corrections and the criminal justice system. Community custody facilities would come under the auspice of community corrections. This will enhance the role of community corrections in facilitating rehabilitation of offenders. 24/7 supervised community custody options will provide courts with credible alternatives to use in lieu of imprisonment. They would go there under a probation order with a residency clause. Community custody fills the missing link in corrections architecture between secure prisons and community supervision. If we change the role of secure prisons to be used only for longer sentenced or dangerous offenders and utilise the community custody option for the rest, then we have a plan that can reduce Queensland's prison daily state by 1,000 within 3 years. That's 1,000 less in prison each day in 3 years' time, and it could largely eliminate the need for juvenile detention facilities as they currently exist. Beyond the first 3 years, there would be a continuing reduction in the use of secure prisons through reduced recidivism. I've recommended the creation of a steering committee under the auspice of the Justice Reform Office of prominent First Nation and non-First Nation people to oversight finalisation of the business case for 3 pilot projects and for the expansion of that concept to reach our target of 1,000 less in jail over the next 3 years. Our plan would result in smaller, high-security facilities which would be safer for staff and more therapeutic for prisoners with improved rehabilitation outcomes. I respectfully suggest that my recommendations, if accepted, can be enacted urgently and provide the basis for a new paradigm in the way that human service delivery agencies and criminal justice system functions. This new paradigm will achieve large reductions in crime, recidivism, stronger families and communities, and massive social and economic benefits. Feedback I've received from across the sectors of government, the wider community, practitioners, and from people in disadvantaged communities tells me that my recommendations will capture their imagination and support for action to address this terrible situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was short, sharp, punchy, and support your submission. Mr. Fredericks, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Keith, for that presentation on your submission, and I've read your submission as well. Just wanting to, from you, get a clearer idea as well on the transition from what we've got now, because you've outlined a model in terms of the components of the model in terms of a hub, and that hub being community controlled with a number of organisations, well, not organisations but functions from within that hub. Some of those functions that you outlined that would be in that hub are currently held in some communities, well, most communities that we've visited with this inquiry and the last inquiry, by other NGOs at this current time. So would you propose they all be wrapped into one hub, under one bigger organisation? And also what kind of transitionary measures would need to be in place in your thinking, through your model that you've proposed, for that to happen? And then for the time frame around that, what kind of time frame do you think that would take based on your consultation?
Let's imagine that the Justice Reform Office is in place. At the moment, we've got individual agencies delivering silo-type services, and we've got not-for-profits doing similar things. If the structure that I envisage would be the Justice Reform Office sitting there, we would need a interdepartmental committee involving agencies from the criminal justice system and human service delivery agencies, and the steering committee I mentioned of the Aboriginal and non-First Nation people to oversight what I'm about to describe. So if we had those sort of things in place, the first thing is a co-design model to work out the best way to do it, and we need some pilot sites to work on. We've got a potential pilot site or a locked-in pilot site in the Charleville, Augathella, Mount Tabor Station region, another one at Cherbourg, and one here in Brisbane, which would service certain areas. What we would do in conjunction with, and we've talked this through with Queensland Corrections, we would have set up a co-design team, and we would work then with the various agencies to look at the functions. So if we take the Charleville example, what functions would we put into that child and community hub that we've set up? I've listed full suite in my submission, but it might vary from location to location. And then we would do a business case for that particular model and for the other 2 places. So the timing would be, we estimate between the time the starting gun was fired, that around 4 to 6 months we would have investment grade business cases for those 3 pilots that would go to government for trial. The steering committee sitting over the top of that with the Justice Reform Office, we would then move into implementation under their oversight with corrections and police and other agencies working to get this fired up and going. And then once it's open, the courts in those regions would start diverting prisoners from the courts. So in other words, at the moment, and I've spoken to the Chief Magistrate, the Deputy Chief and the Magistrate in charge of the Murray Court, and they suggested the idea of, instead of giving people a prison sentence, they would issue a probation order with a residency clause to go to the healing and rehab centres we're proposing. So they get diverted at the court So once the pilot studies are approved, that starts to happen, and corrections then don't have to process people in and out of jail. They go straight into these facilities, which are relatively small compared to current prisons. As they start to function, and we're working on the anticipation that in fact they'll work well, they can start rolling out to other First Nations communities, and we've got a number lined up who said pick us. And that's where the 3 years comes from. We believe then we have, say, 4 to 6 months to get the business cases approved, then we'd need another 3 to 6 months to get them operational in the sense of recruiting staff, training, getting our stuff in place. So there's a year gone by basically. And then over the next 3 years, as we spread around Queensland, and based on my experience, people that I've talked to in corrections, and I've dealt with prisoners in the system for years, there's probably more than 2,500 First Nation people in jail today. And I would suggest from my experience, and this is supported by people I've spoken to in corrections, that at least 1,000 of those could finish up in these sort of alternative options that I've talked about. We have experience in this. When I was Director General of Corrective Services from the late 80s through to the late 90s, early 90s, we had an earlier version of this with outstations and supervised hospitals and various things that allowed us to actually close Woodford Prison. So we closed that back in the early 90s by diverting people away to a range of community things. And we did that pretty quickly. Within about 9 months, we'd sort of got all this change happening. So I don't think the 3 years is over-ambitious. I think we can get 1,000 out in 3 years if there's a will, and particularly if it's driven by the steering committee under the auspices of the Justice Reform Office, who also keeps an interdepartmental committee informed of how this is going, and if there's a will there for that, this can happen. We've also worked out the sort of structure of the co-design process, which is critical.
In your submission, you also referred to what you call a market-led proposal. You
Yes.
talked about that, and I just wanted to know where's that at, because the submission was sent in to us some time ago, so I just wanted to get a bit of an update from you on where that work is at.
Yeah, well, that's sort of been a hiatus, I guess. The last knowledge I have, it's been in now for a couple of years before the government, and it did get a tick from the Market-Led Proposal Secretariat and was recommended to government to proceed. That was prior to the last election, and then went into caretaker mode and didn't proceed. After that, I have now since spoken to Senior Government Minister around December. I was then referred to the Premier's Department, spoke to somebody there, that was in December, and I've heard nothing more.
Right. We might follow that up ourselves. Kim, I'll refer back to you.
Thanks, Keith. I think you've presented your usual strong case with some really interesting ideas in there. Since we've released the draft report, we've received a full data dump from government, which will help us create a compelling case for the situation as it is. We hadn't had that data when we completed the draft report. We've got it now, and it produces some confronting information. There's no doubt about that. So I think the case for change is there and can be made and will be made in our final report. There's a couple of things that I wanted to dig a little deeper on. I think there's an intuitive appeal with many of the things you raise. The community at large may find that a difficult pill to swallow, that we're going soft on crime with those sorts of recommendations. Carrying community sentiment will probably be crucial to any significant change that government may feel inclined to make. Do you have any views on how that may be achieved?
Yes. Interestingly, over the years, particularly when we embarked on a similar reform program, not quite as ambitious as I've talked about here in corrections, I spoke to lots and lots of community groups across Queensland about the model, and we had our local people talking to community groups. And basically, and that's why I like this place-based approach, because if you go place to place to place, you can deal with identifiable communities and talk to the people there. Most people in the community, in my experience, are very reasonable about this. There's an initial reaction when you see that, like, TV news now at 6 o'clock turns crime into entertainment. It's, you've got car crashes, police chases, all sorts of stuff, and people are quite concerned that there's horrible things happening out there, which there are. But when people are confronted with the circumstances I've described here and understand that people are going to jail for a few weeks or a few months and being churned out again and coming back and so forth, they recognise that those sort of people don't need to be in high security jails. When you go to local communities, where we put our Western outreach camps right through Western Queensland, we went there and held community meetings to start with, explained what was happening, the prisoners were coming. We asked whether you were happy to accept this situation. Some communities said no, so we didn't go there. But when they say yes, they get really involved because, first of all, we start spending money there, we buy local food, we do all that sort of thing, we create jobs. People are well supervised, and right across Queensland in those camps, there are very, very small issues.
So you don't see gaining community support an impediment?
No, not for this model, because we're talking here in that Charleville, Augathella, Mount Tabor, we're talking about 62 people in our model for that whole 3 areas. Then we go to other places. We're talking between around mostly 20-person type groups, and there's a lot of them to do. But once you go there and talk face to face with communities, understand what's involved, they understand there's some local jobs, they understand that what we're doing. These offenders in the main are doing community work in those communities, so there's all of that comes into play. If you just went down Queen Street now and started talking about it, people would say shock horror. But under this model, as I've said, dangerous people won't be out there.
Where are remandees in this situation? Where do they fit into the model you propose?
Remanded is a very important component of our model, because if we take, we've got 2 pilot projects before the Queensland Government. We've had there now for a couple of years as well, for women in remand. Now, most people on remand have a bail option, which they can't exercise because either they haven't got money, or they've got no decent place to live, or they're a substance abuser or something of that nature. This model is ideal, particularly for women in that situation.
So it solves those issues.
Sorry?
It solves those issues.
Solves those issues. Because the legal representative can get up in court and say, look, we've got a 24 supervised facility, it's in this area, they've got drug rehab and they've got detox and blah, 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 can we send the person there? So they would go there. They'd get their bail to live in that place under an order to reside there. And then we've had a relationship with Sisters Inside on that proposal, where they would provide legal and other counselling services. So when we take the woman back to court, then there's a less likelihood of getting a custodial sentence, because we've got a pathway planned beyond that supervised custody. So they're ideal in that sense. And the other thing too, in prisons we tend to put people in large lumps, 50 cell blocks, that sort of thing. Yep. And when you get 50 antisocial people in one block and you get 1,000 people in the whole prison, the prisoner culture is far stronger than the staff culture, I can say. When we're talking around 20 offenders, we can give very individualised treatment of these people, and we have a whole different model. We would have welcome to countries and smoking ceremonies and things on reception, rather than the sort of nonsense you go through at the moment, or have to go through in secure prisons. So it's a totally different approach, and behavioural issues drop. We found that in our work camps, because it's a much more humane relationship between staff and offenders. So it's ideal for people on remand that are coming in for short periods, particularly when the atrocious thing that happens is a lot of people spend time in remand and stay there for quite a while all this gets processed, and they get released because they've already served time, and it's just a waste of money.
Yes. Do you have another question?
Not at this time.
The existing legislative framework, will it allow this sort of proposed model you suggest?
In the discussion I had with the Chief Magistrate, the Deputy and the Magistrate in the Murray Court, we discussed this. They couldn't see an impediment, because they came up with, they said, well, if we can now give, under our current legislation, we can give a probation order and we can apply conditions. So they do a probation with the residency clause. They made, the only qualification they put on that was it was just a discussion, and they said, look, we'd have to check, but we can't see a problem, and indeed if there is something, we'd help draft something to change it, you know. But I can't, in my experience, I can't see how it'd be a problem.
So how close, Keith, would the smaller facilities be to some communities? Would they be in the community? Would they be alongside, next suburb, next region?
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
I'll give you 2 examples, 3 examples. In the Charleville, Augathella, Mount Tabor Station community, there would be facilities in Charleville itself, on the fringe of the township, and there'd be another facility at Augathella, where we've already had a prison work camp at Charleville and Augathera as well, so they're well used to this, and the prison work camp in Charleville is right in Charleville, so it would be right adjacent to those towns. And then there'd be a facility on Mount Tabor Station, which is an hour and 3/4 drive from Augathella up to the back of the Carnarvon Gorge, and it's a 200,000 acre property, so it'd be sitting in the middle of that. So that's, and we've talked to the Merway Shire, who are actually offering us buildings in Charleville, so they're very happy to have us there. And likewise the Augathella Township, very happy to have us there. If we go to Cherbourg, we did have a facility lined up in the middle of town. That's now been lost to us for other things in the delay, but we have now got a facility just outside of Mergen, near Cherbourg, which is on property owned by the First Nations Silver Lining Foundation, and so we'll go there. And the one in Brisbane is over in West End. And once again, the community there are accepting. So we go around and we sort of, once people understand what it's about and how it's going to run, it's fine. And the people in Cherbourg, Charleville, Augathella are very keen to have it.
Keith, if you could snap your fingers and this model was in place today, so 1,000 inmate reduction in existing jails, a range of lower security, more holistic type centres out there. What's it done to the corrections budget? Any views at all? I mean, you've got a unique background in many regards. You'd probably have a view, I suspect.
Yeah, I do. I saw this on a graph in Northern Europe because they went through this process way back. Holland, after the Second World War, said we're not going to build another prison cell. They were just horrified about what had happened and so forth, and all that. And if you look at a graph, when you implement what I've just talked about, you've got to tip some money in the front end because it doesn't automatically take people out quickly, and you're stuck with your infrastructure and the churn that's going on. So if you look at the current increase in imprisonment rate, I know for a fact between 2006 and 2016, it went up by 90%, prison population, and it's still going up at that rate. So we've got this graph with a line like that. We'd pour some money in the front end, and I would say it would be 3 to 5 years before we would start to see this upward trajectory on the prison stuff start to flatten out. If you go out a decade, you're going to see some big things. Now, what I put in the market-led proposal submission is that this is why we need an investment-grade business case. I don't want to just see a business case for those 3 centres. I want to see this extrapolated, pick up this 1,000 beds and run these costs and come up with a proper model. So I could see I've been talking to a big accounting firm to sort of come in and do a proper modelling of that. And I think that one of the issues that the government's grappling with on this is that they have to find an amount of money up front to put in.
For perhaps deferring capital later down the track.
Exactly. And at the moment, high security prisons cost about $1 million a cell to build. And I just saw a thing in the paper the other day about juvenile stuff, what the cost of that is. And I did a big job in Northern Territory recently where the whole new prison came in at about $1 billion for 1,000 cells. And that's horrifying in itself, but because a heck of a lot can be changed, massive savings in that infrastructure going down if we go down this path. But I can't give you the exact years when those converging lines would start to drop, but it's probably a decade out. But big money would accrue.
I'm just going to call it to a close there, Keith, and we've got a little bit of time that I can open up to the floor for 1 or 2, maybe, depending how long it lasts, for comments to Keith, if anyone does have a comment. Wayne, please identify yourself and where you're from, please, before you.
Wayne Sanderson, representing the Balanced Justice campaign, which is now winding down on youth justice system, but also Antar, Queensland, are more directly relevant to the topic here today. Keith, question. Given the some experience that's already been had that could be of some relevance here, is there anything valuable in the experience of the state of Texas and what they did with their adult prison system over the last 10 years?
Yeah, there is. When I read about that, what they're doing in Texas at the moment is, I guess, what we did back in about the late 80s, early 90s with the Queensland Corrective Services Commission, and I mentioned the closing of Woodford Prison, where they start to bring in a range of community options that can be used. So they're at the early stages of doing that. I haven't seen in what they've done that they're doing a holistic response that we're talking about. I think the big issue here, that except for Northern Europe, that what's been missed in Australia is we just don't deal with those dysfunctional community circumstances which keep generating. So even when people talk about through care and stuff, they're not, it's a buzzword, but they're not out there doing the holistic change on the work in the communities.
Thank you. I'm actually going to draw that to a close there now, because I don't want to butt into the next lot of time.
Yep.
So thank you, Keith, for your presentation and for your submission.
Thank you.
And the team may follow up on that other submission that Market led, just to see if there's something we can find out a bit more information.
I'd echo Brian's comments. Your submission's been well thought through and distilled through a lifetime's experience in this, and it's you make some very interesting points. So much appreciated. Well
Thank
done.
you very much.
You.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.